Hello, and welcome to this edition of Inside Legal ESG. I am so pleased to have with us today Paddy Linighan, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Clyde Co. He is based in London. Welcome, Paddy.
Thanks, Pam. Good to meet you.
I am so excited about our conversation today. Tell us about your various roles at Clyde Co. or even before Clyde Co.
Yeah, no problem. My career started out originally as a chartered accountant some time ago. But as my clients developed, I got an interest in law firms as one of my audit clients. And effectively hooked me. I'm a law firm lifer, and I have been since I qualified. I spent a few years with what is now DLA Piper in finance and planning roles, then 13 years with Squire Patton Boggs, or what is now Squire Patton Boggs, in both finance and strategic planning roles, and I moved across to Clyde Co in 2010, ostensibly to work on projects for the then CEO.
Mm-hmm.
The first project Peter got me to work on was the merger with Barlow Lyde and Gilbert.
Yes.
So first few months working on the merger, two big firms coming together. The next role required was integration. So I took then from business manager into integration director. Then having put the two firms together, they needed to be run as the operations. So I then took on the role of chief operating officer for our UK operations, and I held that role through till about 2019. Change in CEO, the firm's much bigger and much more diverse to manage. So Matthew, who's our current CEO, asked a number of our existing COOs to start to look across the piece rather than down the piece, if that makes sense. And so I picked up looking at real estate and workplace services across the operations globally, trying to create a much more consistent approach, both in how we delivered services, but also how we looked and felt, which when we came to the back end of 2020, still going through pandemic, we recognized the increasing importance of ESG as it was evolving, and in particular, environmental impact. And given that we didn't know what we didn't know at the time, it was felt that environment, it must be to do with our offices, it must be to do with our operations. You can go and have a look at it. So from the early part of 2021, I started to try to understand what our impact actually was on the environment, what factors were influencing it, and also in partnership with third-party sustainability providers, now Accenture, which at the time was Carbon Intelligence. Try to understand, well, what our peer group was doing, what our clients wanted us to do, what our people wanted us to do, just to get a sense of understanding our impact and then understanding where we should go. And in that regard, it became very clear that it wasn't just about our buildings. It was very much about our supply chain. Any corporate occupier, any law firm, I think when you start to understand your greenhouse gas emissions impact, you'll be very surprised at the proportion that sits in there. I think ours is relatively atypical. About 5% of our emissions sits in our scope 1 or scope 2, which is the energy we either consume or purchase directly for use in our buildings, for heating, cooling, power, etc. But then the remaining 95% can be broadly split into a third of business travel, a third is the purchased goods and services that we acquire to run our operations, and then the third is broadly the purchased goods and services we acquire on behalf of our clients, the disbursements. So it was recognized it was very much more than a real estate problem, if I can put it that way. And so in the summer of 22, I took on the execution of our environmental strategy and a wider ESG strategy as the full-time role, and started to work up then, well, if this was our impact, what should we be doing about it? How should we go about it? Do we want to stay in the pack, or do we want to try and drive change? And it's probably fair to say our board were very supportive of wanting to drive change and be advocates for change. So we believe we've set ourselves some pretty highly ambitious targets. We're going to be pretty transparent about what it is we're trying to do. and trying to push forward. And we're also going to hopefully, and I do say hopefully, influence others to change as well, to get on the journey with us. And the Chief Operating Officer role or title, if you like, from that time didn't really reflect what I was doing. Didn't really reflect some of the challenges we were trying to address both internally and externally. And so the firm appointed me as their first Chief Sustainability Officer on the 1st of July 23. And I have to say, it's a fantastic role, and I'm enjoying every single day of it.
So here's the $10 million question, or £10 million pound question. When they appointed you CSO, did they actually make somebody else COO, or are these duties in addition to the job you've always had? Because that's usually what happens, is like, here's another thing to put on your desk.
To be fair, that probably was while I was still doing the COO role. It was off the side of the desk. But no, with regards to real estate workplace services, I had an excellent number 2 in Dawn, and they promoted Dawn to being director of workplace services and real estate, so I could focus solely on our ESG, and particularly the environmental, our pro bono and social impact pillars in terms of how we push forward. So no, dedicated 100% to this, nothing else.
That's a huge commitment. Yeah, and that in and itself is showing leadership, because that isn't, I haven't seen a lot of that at law firms yet. I think it's coming, of course. You mentioned business travel as a third of your scope 3. Are you willing to share with us how you're addressing business travel? Because most lawyers say, oh, I can't change my travel habits. I need to see my clients, la, 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 right?
Yeah, we've, again, very supportive from the board, and we've tried to come at this from a point of view of effectively treating all of our colleagues as adults, and being very clear as to why we need to reframe our mindset. And you're absolutely right. This pre-pandemic, historically, we've traveling all over the place: business development, conferences, partner conferences, team development, etc. Pandemic proved that we didn't have to do that all of the time. Although it was obviously to the other extreme where nobody was traveling. Our travel has started to come back into the business, but in the summer of 23, the board agreed a set of principles around sustainable travel. And this was really aimed at changing our default from I must travel to should I travel? And if I do, can I do it differently? And do I need to go as many times? So it's frequency and mode of travel. But I think it's probably fair to say, having heard of the sort of the Netflix act in the best interest policy of Netflix, we've pretty much done a little bit of that with regards to our travel. It's act in the best interest of Clyde Co, both from the point of view of what our clients want us to do. How do we rebalance the maintenance of social capital across the organization? How do we rebalance the business development, and just start to think of it in that sort of context? We think the sustainable travel next level is we're effectively going to take away a lot of hard policies and principles, and just we'll give some guidance to our travel management companies. So instead of, say, perhaps giving the 3 cheapest options, we give the 3 greenest options, but then leave it to the individual with that sort of very simplistic act in the best interests of in background, and look then to provide the right information so they can make their own decisions, better informed decisions. And we'll look to police it afterwards. Did talk with our Matthew, the CEO, because we're an organization now about 5,500, approaching 6,000 people. Impossible to police pre-travel, so we look at it post-travel. And basically we work on a 3 strikes and you're out type approach. So it's just, or 3 strikes and you're gonna have a conversation type approach. Because it's going to take time to change behaviors. But
it's a process, right? It's a process, not an event.
Absolutely. And I think we will look to also supplement that through the course of 24-25 by moving away from financial budgets for travel to carbon budgets, as a means of saying, well, this is the maximum amount of carbon we can spend this year. Spend it wisely. So
Well, and
that's
you
sort of a
almost,
direction of travel, no pun intended.
yeah, yeah, it's very, very clever. And it's almost like we have to do that if we, meaning collectively, if we are going to get to our targets, right? You have a budget and you have to stay within that budget. Speaking of targets, have you set net zero targets? Or are you in the process of doing that? Where are you on that journey?
Right. We have had our near-term targets validated by the SBTi, which will
Okay,
see us reach, or at least target, Scope 1, Scope 2, 80% reduction by 2030, and Scope 3, a 50% reduction by 2030.
excellent.
We are just dotting the I's and crossing the T's now on our long-term target submission. That'll be going in this month. In part, the slight delays, we now understand under the revised submission routines that have to have a much more up-to-date emissions footprint, and 2019 is a bit too far back because that's our baseline year. So we're literally just dotting the I's, crossing the T's on our 2023 emissions footprint, which I have to say shows improvement from 2019 without actually direct action, which
Yeah,
is
that's
was
very good.
a surprise to me. But we're looking at setting net zero for 2038.
Excellent.
And it's
Excellent.
an absolute emissions reduction target, not
Yeah.
a intensity or related.
Yeah.
It's absolute. So we know our footprint in 2019 is 110,000 tons approximately. So we know we've got to decarbonize 90% of that at least. So
These are big tasks ahead of us. What are you finding the most challenging aspect of your new role?
um, not enough time in the day.
Yes.
I guess the most challenging to date is I felt we've been 3 years on this journey. Up to this particular point in time, and it feels like we've really only been target setting and ambition setting, and I'm really itching to get on and take action. So that's been one of the biggest challenges, is my frustration not being able to take action, or as much action as I'd like. But I think the other challenge is engagement, and that's engagement in a wider sense, not just within the organization, but externally as well. I've often described this journey, and I think this is a journey that business as a whole has to go on, as like the peloton in the Tour de France. There are some who are at the front who are trying to get away, but actually we need to keep to the body and all move together. And there are some at the back who are not quite sure whether they want to stay in the race or even be in it at all. We need to keep bringing those people along, or those firms along. So to me, that the challenge is keeping everybody converging on ultimately the same goal at the same pace, which I know that's a micro problem for the firm, macro problem for the legal profession, a global problem for economy as a whole. So,
Yep. Yep.
yeah.
And I think part of what is helping with that goal is the whole scope 3 measurement, right? Because companies who aren't even thinking about this yet certainly have clients or vendors or suppliers who are starting to ask these questions. And suddenly a business says, oh, I guess my number one customer needs to know what my greenhouse gas emissions are. I've never measured my greenhouse gas emissions. I better get on this journey. And that is really what is motivating a lot of companies, and including law firms, is client pressure.
Absolutely. And I would say the scope 3 trickle down effect through the corporate structures. Every organization is genuinely somebody's supply chain.
Yes.
And
Yes.
for you, if you reduce your scope 3 emissions, you are helping your clients reduce their scope 3 emissions.
Yep.
And by the same token, your suppliers, by reducing their scope 3 emissions, are helping you reduce yours, ultimately helping the client reduce theirs. So it is the key to everything. And it's the bit, whilst it's the most challenging potentially, because people are at different stages of their journeys and businesses at different stages of their journey, it's the one that makes the most difference.
Yes.
Getting people on the journey makes the most difference. And that's one of the areas in which I taught about us having sort of high ambition and transparency. That, if I can call it leadership piece, is that advocacy for change, is not forcing people on the journey, say, but actually encouraging people on the journey. But at some point in time, we will be obliging them to be on a journey.
Yes.
We've just started our own supply chain engagement back in September. We took our top 200 suppliers and we've asked them the question, where are you up to? What are you doing? do you measure your greenhouse gas emissions? Can we see it? Can we replace our spend-based data with the sort of the factors and give us real emissions data? And we'll work with you on that basis. But we've our sustainable supplier principles, or sustainable principles policy we issued. I have to edit that one out. It's sort of engaging now, but we've already marked the card. We will oblige our suppliers to meet our targets as a minimum in approximately 24 to 36 months.
Yes.
That should allow most organizations now to get on that journey. And those top 200, based on spend-based data, account for 70% of our Scope 3 emissions.
Right.
So you can make a lot big inroads by just biggest for best, arguably.
Yes.
And hopefully the rest.
And I like your word oblige, because I have seen examples where the client of a law firm sent the law firm the EcoVadis assessment for the first time and said, you know, we would like you to take this assessment. The first year score will not be evaluated, but we certainly will expect to see progress in year 2. So you're given a grace year, but after that, you better be making progress. So it was a really interesting approach.
And we recognize that.
Yep.
And we have experienced that as well. And
Yep.
to be fair, it's seemingly, when I talk about convergence, we know that the regulatory framework is starting to converge, the reporting frameworks are starting to converge. I think the assessment frameworks are also starting to converge, or the requirements so the standard seems to be a science-based target for emissions reductions. EcoVadis, I know they're not the only one, but certainly in Europe, they're one of the ones that come to the fore.
Yes.
And the one thing I find interesting about EcoVadis is it gets more difficult every year.
Yes.
The demands become more onerous, and so to maintain your score, you have to improve.
Yes.
Never mind improve to improve your score. That makes sense.
Right. That's exactly right. Just to maintain, you have to keep doing better and better.
Yeah.
So what has been the most rewarding part of your work in this new role?
All of it. The fact I am
like
dedicated 100% to this area as a focus. If you'd have asked me as a young, fresh-faced trainee accountant coming out at 24, 25, what would you be doing by the time you reach 55, 56? I'd have said the same thing. But having the opportunity to do something I am personally invested in as well, there are days where it doesn't feel like a job. It's I think there's a phrase used, it's my duvet flip.
Yeah.
It's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So I always like to ask my podcast guests, if I have you back as a guest in 1 year's time, what will we be talking about?
Ooh, 2024 is an interesting year. A lot of uncertainty.
Globally, yes.
Globally, a lot of uncertainty. I think I was looking at a headline a few weeks ago before the Taiwanese election that we have something like democratic elections in over 70 countries in the world,
Yes.
over 50% of the world's population, and it includes some of the more progressive or indeed conservative economies, India, Taiwan, US, Great Britain. So that political geoscape at the end of 2024 could be very different to the one we sit in now. So in 1 year's time, be interested to see what that looks like, and whether the political landscape has bowed to populist pressure, or whether it's supporting the climate change agenda. So that's the background will have changed, certainly the context in which we operate. Going back to one of the earlier comments, what we'll talk about in 1 year's time, hopefully the genuine progress that we are making both as a firm and as a profession collectively in reducing our emissions and advocating for change. I know in 12 months' time, I want to be able to say to you, Pam, we set out like this, the actions here are working, these actions are not quite working, so we're going to put a bit more focus, but we are genuinely reducing our impact. Yes. And that's what I like to be talking about, and this is how.
Yep. And I think that's a commitment that many companies that are on this journey are committed to. regardless of what happens in the political environment. So for instance, the political environment might change, and it might change the regulations around this. It might change the way we talk about it, but at least for the companies that I've been talking to, the commitments aren't changing, the actions aren't changing. They're making progress every year. So I'm hopeful that will continue. So that leads into my final question. In this age of acrimony and politicization of ESG, what gives you hope?
Momentum.
Mm.
I believe we've got, and it's the way you've sort of articulated prior to that question is absolutely right. The private sector commitments are still there. And unless people wish to be tarred with the misrepresenting greenwashing type approach, you've got to deliver against those commitments. And again, with that trickle down effect into our supply chain, we're encouraging others to also come onto this journey. There will become a tipping point where it becomes like a bullet train. You can't stop it. And I know that there is that phrase of it should be a just transition. It should be normal 1.5 degree related by 2050. I think we know we're not going to hit that. I think practicality, we're not taking action quick enough. But I think that momentum will kick in pretty soon, hopefully in the next 3 to 5 year window, and we'll have what I think is called by the sort of economists, the modelists, a delayed transition. Which will then just have a really, really interesting period of time. I'm hoping I'm still in the role when
Yes.
when that kicks off. But yeah, that's what gives me hope. It's momentum. The private actors are pushing this, not the government and regulators. So even if we have quite a bit of populist change, if you like, over the course of the next 12 months, hopefully be for the good. And it'll give us a boost to that acceleration. But even if it's not, even if it is slightly more conservative, even if it is sort of anti, I think the momentum will overcome.
Yeah, and I love the phrase you used, tipping point, because we are going to get there when ESG will no longer probably even be talked about, because it's just the way we do business. It's just the way all businesses operate. It's not something new or different. It's what we do.
Absolutely.
Part of our culture, part of who we are.
And I fully expect, for example, the phrase ESG to disappear.
Yeah,
it'll just become sustainability.
Yep.
And it's how we, I think, you're absolutely right, how we do business is at least as important now as the business we do, but it's going to become more important as we go through. And it's just part of our DNAs. And certainly that's one of my targets for 2026 is that people think of the sustainability function as just a function. It's not trying to change anything. It's just what we do.
Yep. I am going to celebrate with you when we get to that point. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I hope it has given ideas and insights to other law firms who perhaps are dabbling in this, but really need to jump in with both feet and be, as you said, leaders and agents of change. Thank you so much, Paddy, and congratulations to Clyde Co on taking this step.
Thank you, Pam. Pleasure speaking to you.